I was looking at the brochure for the symposium, and I noticed that there's a dedication to two different people. The first, if you haven't seen it, is Tatiana Schlossberg, and she is the granddaughter of President JFK. She passed away from acute myeloid leukemia earlier, I believe, within the last 6 months, maybe a little longer than that. She was an activist for cancer, scientific funding, and mostly making sure that in our current government system, we keep a focus on real science. The other individual who is dedicated is Andrea Gibson. She was a poet, and their work, centered on putting words to a human experience. And so I like to think that Tatiana Schlossberg is the reason that Larry invited me here. Cancer activism and patient advocacy is something I will talk about all day. And I like to think that Andrea Gibson, putting words to the experience of being a soul in a human body, is why I said yes. All right. The bad news is I am talking about pediatric cancer. The good news is I don't have a single chart, analytical assessment, or data point. So sit back and enjoy 30 slides. We're going to start by talking through breakthrough therapies. Breakthrough therapies dominate the conversations around cancer medicine, and we measure those things in the headlines, right? We talk about trials, innovations, and outcomes. And I'm here to tell you the story of the family that is holding that innovation, the family living through the illness. It looks much different for us. For us, it's not conversations happening in labs or boardrooms. It's conversations in hospital hallways, across dinner tables, and in protocols that have long stretches of uncertainty. I am going to start my talk today, by introducing you to a woman. This is Ruth Crawford. Most of you don't know her. She was born April of 1925. And by the early 1950s, Ruth was 25 years old and married. And very quickly after getting married, she had 5 children in quite quick succession. Shortly after her youngest, her 5th child, was born, she became very ill. And she went to the doctor. Finally, the nature of her condition was in her female parts, as they called him. So she was delayed by the birth of all of these children. Sequentially, she thought maybe it had something to do with that. When she finally went to the doctor to address it, it was determined that her body was riddled with cancer. And shortly after the diagnosis, in 1954, Ruth Crawford died. Her adult children, are described saying about that time that it was like one day she was there and the next day she just wasn't. These are Ruth Crawford's 5 children. This photo is from a couple years after she died. When she passed away, they were 6. Priscilla was 6, Janella 5, Alice was 4, Mary was 3, and Buster, Floyd, in the middle, was 18 months. They grew up without a mother. They grew up not knowing how she had died. It was the 1950s, and you did not talk about these things. So when they asked about her, their Nana promised them she was in a better place. And the murmurings in the household among the extended family were that maybe it was all of the kids that her husband had forced her to have. Maybe that was what had caused this. Obviously, I don't think there's scientific data to prove that, but that is what these children grew up understanding. That one day their mother was there, and the next day she went to the doctor and she did not come home, and possibly it was their fault. The story has many dynamics that we could go into, but what I'm going to posit today is that I'm going to discuss how we can change what is passed down. What is passed down through a family when shame and grief threaten to drown out medical agency. One of Ruth Crawford's children is Alice. Alice is up here in this photo. And Alice went on to have a daughter of her own. This is a picture from shortly after her daughter was born. She was born at Boulder Community Hospital. And on the day that her daughter was born, Alice called her Nana to tell her the good news. She called Ruth Crawford's mother, her grandmother, and she said, "I've had a baby girl." And Nana started crying very hard, and Alice was confused about why she was so upset. And Nana said, "It is your mother's birthday. How could you not know?" But of course she didn't know, because the day Ruth Crawford died, everyone stopped talking about her. The story stopped with her death. At 4 years old, Alice's mother had died, and now, some 30 years later, she had given birth to a daughter on that mother's birthday. That daughter was me. I was born on April 13th and share a birthday with a grandmother that I never met, who died from a cancer that we still aren't sure about. Ruth Crawford had 5 children. They went on to have families, and she has 9 grandchildren and 18 great-grandchildren. 32 living descendants of a woman whose story was not shared because of grief and shame. So, not to fast forward through all the good parts, but I grew up and I got married to this handsome fellow right here, who's also right there, Joshua. And we got married, and we do what young married couples do, and we had 3 babies. Bowden Isaac, Jude Abram, and Selah Ruth. I named our youngest daughter after my grandmother, and I thought that that was a full circle moment, her story shared through the story of our daughter. Little did I know, our story was really just beginning. On January 19th, 2019, our oldest son, Bowden, at 6 years old, was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia. His genetics were favorable. He was standard risk. I remember the doctors telling us it was the best cancer that he could get. That was an odd thing for him to say, but as we've experienced pediatric cancer, we actually know that to be true. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia has over a 90% cure rate and is one of the most diagnosed and also studied cancers in the pediatric space. Very quickly after diagnosis, my husband and I took time to call our parents, my parents and his parents, and let them know, and we were met with a significant amount of worry. Most of that is natural because we were telling them their grandchild had cancer. But a lot of it was from the misconception of what leukemia meant. Most of you in the room, some of you, were alive in the 1970s and 60s and 70s. And at that point, leukemia was a death sentence. And so when we called our parents to tell them about their grandson's diagnosis, that was the story they were carrying forward for him. We promised them, we promised the doctors, we promised Bowden, we promised his siblings, we promised them that the doctors knew exactly what it would take for Bowden to get better. Standard risk therapy lasts around 2.5 years. It's actually quite a long process. 2.5 years of doctor's appointments, clinic visits, daily at-home chemo, bone marrow biopsies, spinal taps. Pediatric cancer is not simply an illness, it is an entire childhood. Over 20 months into treatment, Bowden's siblings, they started to realize that life was going to start revolving very tightly around him and him alone. It was part of childhood for Bowden, but it was also part of childhood for his brother and sister. These are normal pictures from my photo stream during that time. Everyone's childhood was on pause. The conversations we were having were not about soccer or birthday parties or whether it was warm enough to go swimming. They were about whether his counts were high enough, his blood counts, for us to leave the house. Treatment was not just a protocol for us, it was a family culture. Over 600 days of at-home chemo, 70 doctor appointments in Denver, more than 50 local lab visits to check his blood counts, 8 bone marrow biopsies, and 10 spinal fluid samples. Standard therapy, the promise that it was working. In November of 2020, with 4 months left on treatment, we had a routine spinal fluid sample that revealed that Bo had leukemic cells in his spinal fluid, a relapse. The problem was when they take that sample, they also administer intrathecal chemotherapy, and so there would be no way to test for certain until a follow-up visit 6 weeks later. And so we did what all people do when they are traumatized. We put the kids in front of a screen and walked into the middle distance. I remember looking at our 3-year-old daughter and thinking, this is her entire life. She was just a baby when Bowden was born. And treatment for relapse was very clear. It was 2 more years of additional chemotherapy, higher doses, more time inpatient. And because of his spinal fluid involvement, it would include intracranial radiation. My husband and I looked at each other as we walked her down this road, and I thought, this can't be her entire life. There has to be another way. That way felt very unclear. There was not AI. I couldn't ask AI what we should do. I asked Google. We'll get to that later in the story. But we had to wait for the next set of tests, and so we do what all people do in trauma, which is disassociated completely. What that looked like was we packed up our entire family from Boulder, Colorado, where you have to remember at this point, it was November of 2020. It was a very scary time with the pandemic. People were taking things very seriously, social distancing, all of the precautions. We packed up our children and we flew to an island in Florida. We affectionately call it Denial Island, but you guys might know it as Sanibel Island. And it turns out, I don't know if you guys knew this, but COVID didn't exist in Florida. And we figured if we were going to be in denial about relapse, we could be in denial about COVID. And we spent 3 weeks on the beach enjoying the ocean. Ironically, or metaphorically, my husband jokes I try to make a metaphor out of everything, but we started taking pictures during that trip, and we had the unspoken agreement that we were taking them because they would likely be our last. And the irony of that is that Bowden decided it would be time to start covering my face in every photo that I tried to take with him, which I could only laugh at because I couldn't quite explain to him how much I needed him just to stand for the photo. We would wear the kids out at the beach every day. They didn't know what was happening. We didn't tell them why we were there. They just thought we were wildly spontaneous parents who had taken them on a vacation. We acted like nothing was happening, and then we went home. We would come home from the beach and put them to bed, and then my husband and I would spend all evening on the internet trying to find a solution. We figured there was something out there, some other path, some other way that we could avoid the future we were walking into back in Denver. And it was at that point I came across the Emily Whitehead Foundation. Any of you in the immune therapy space might know them. Their daughter, Emily Whitehead, received the first CAR T cell therapy in 2012. She was cured from her refractory leukemia by it, and they started a nonprofit foundation shortly after to make sure that it started as pediatrics, but now they work with all patients, can find access to cell therapy. And so from a condo on Denial Island, I messaged the foundation, and 3 hours later, I got an email back from Tom, Emily's dad, telling us to head to Philadelphia. So, let's see. We found that Philadelphia, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, it's a renowned institution specifically for CAR T therapy. They were offering a trial that Bowden could participate in. And so we headed to Philadelphia for consents, which the consent conversation, I'm going to get there actually, but it's interesting hearing people talk about consents. You'll find out why on the next slide. And again, trying to make a metaphor and meaning out of everything, I joke that I was making Bowden take all of these photos, and I had him turn around. We'd gotten dropped off by the Uber on the wrong side of the road, the Children's Hospital behind us, and I said, "Turn around, I want to get a picture." And I thought it was quite funny that the detour sign was centered on the screen. We promised him that the doctors would cure him. We promised his siblings that he would be cured. And we figured this was merely a detour. But perhaps more importantly than that sad metaphor is the reality that in every photo I took of him from that trip, he is giving me an obnoxious thumbs up. Because that is the story he was telling. He thought that this was the coolest thing he had ever experienced. We were in a big city and in a fancy hotel. We had spent all day at the hospital signing consents, and I looked across the hospital or the hotel room and I found him in this position, ready for another photo. And he said to me as I took it, "This is the nicest hotel I've ever been in. I'm like royalty." And it felt deeply ironic because I had spent the afternoon in a hospital conference room with no windows, under fluorescent lights, signing consents for this trial. The consents had me initial that he would likely lose his fertility and that he would test positive for HIV for the rest of his life. They also said that through this therapy, they could promise nothing, but they could hope that he might have a chance. So I looked at him, claiming royalty, and I thought, heavy is the head. All right, enough of that sadness. Let's skip forward. The therapy that Bowden ended up getting is actually quite remarkable. I know it's kind of funny when I got the instructions on how to present, it was very, make sure you're not too complicated and make sure you're not over the heads of the layman. And I'm like, well, in a room with geneticists and biomolecular scientists and AI wizards, I'm not sure I could be over the head of you on this, but I will do my best to explain it to the 5 of you who don't know about it. Where should I begin? CAR T-cell therapy is made mostly, it's expanding into more hard wall tumors like glioblastoma, but right now it is mostly limited to liquid tumors, so blood cancers. The interesting thing about blood cancer, specifically pediatric leukemia, it's a B-cell leukemia. So the idea don't throw tomatoes. I will try to explain this without being embarrassed by the company I'm in. B cells are produced in your marrow and they're put out and go through normal, replication and division and then death. And B-cell leukemia is when the cells don't know or don't care to die. And so they remain immature for their entire existence. And as they don't die, they also don't leave the bloodstream, which is why your marrow is infiltrated with a high pressure or a high volume of B cells. It's why leg pain is often a symptom of pediatric leukemia. And the other problem is, as all of you are aware, we often have cancerous cells moving in and out of our body as our cells are doing their thing, and our body has an immune system that knows how to find these bad actors and eradicate them before it's a problem. But the trouble with B-cell leukemia is that the T cells, which would be doing that cleanup work, are seeing the B cells and ignoring them because they're thinking, oh yeah, that's a B cell. So it's interesting in that your own body is kind of missing the point, which is what CAR T-cell therapy seeks to prevent. So the idea is you collect the patient's blood through a process called apheresis. The apheresis machine skims off the T cells and then delivers the rest of the blood, the platelets and the other parts of the red blood, back into the patient. And then those T cells are taken to a lab and they are reprogrammed by genetically altering them, inserting a chimeric antigen receptor, a CAR, onto the surface of the T cell. Then with that cell, those handful of cells with the CAR inserted on them, they then multiply them. There's obviously much more to this. They wash them, they check them for quality. But eventually you have a product similar to that. Well, actually, no, I take that back. That's his blood collection product, his T cells. But you eventually have a product of CAR T-cell therapy, which can be administered back into the patient. So the patient's own T cells, genetically modified to accurately identify a B cell as problematic, and then put back in as a treatment. The only problem with it really, well, there's a couple of problems, but the main one is that it doesn't distinguish between healthy B cells and cancerous B cells. It just teaches it to chew up and spit out every B cell it can find. Luckily, there are pharmaceuticals that you can take subclinically or subcutaneously. Immunoglobulin is one of them that helps with your lack of B cells. Your IgG level, at least. There's a whole host of B cells that are just kind of left broken forever. It's a very interesting therapy. It's a very cool therapy. The thing that really encouraged us by it is it's far less toxic. Bowden, as I mentioned, was going to have cranial radiation, which has a whole slew of really horrific side effects for small children. And this avoided that. And more importantly, it's one dose. So he went to Philadelphia and he had a dose of CAR T cell therapy. And there's a bit more to the story of his specific clinical experience that I'm not going to get into. But circling back to the consent conversation, it's actually quite interesting, and Cordelia, based on your question, it is hard to offer consent and hope at the same time, especially in clinical trial medicine, because often the consent paperwork is based on the worst case scenario. And so they've come to find, this was in 2021, they've come to find that fertility is not affected by CAR T cell therapy, mainly because the children getting it are now old enough to be having families of their own. And the details around HIV, I am glad to answer questions on as much as I can later, but it's basically CAR T is built on a viral vector, the lentivirus, which has some proteomic component of HIV. So you don't have HIV, you're not positive of HIV, you're just testing for it. And to speak, the comment I made about Jody, or everyone's kind of conversation, but guided by Jody about finding connection, is the other part of clinical trial medicine is they can't encourage you to talk to anyone because they don't want to be seen as influencing you to participate. And so you can't find out about anyone in the trial, which is why things like Facebook or Google end up being helpful. So thankfully, we were able to find out about a family who was just ahead of us in treatment. This is Emily Lynn Chancellor. That's her dad, Will, on the right. He is a cattle rancher, cotton farmer from deep in Mississippi. The first time I met Will, I remember we were in Philadelphia, and he, with his deep Southern twang, was reminding me how we would do anything for these children. And he was joking, he had his jeans on and his dip in his pocket, and he was joking, even if they got to move me to the big city. A couple months after signing consent, we'd come back to Denver. Bowden and I packed our bags, and we joined the Chancellors in Philadelphia. And when you take a cattle ranching, cotton farming family and a liberal hippie from Boulder family and plop them down in the city of brotherly love, you create a very, very ironic and beautiful extended kind of family. To maintain even 1 ounce of normalcy in this very not normal situation, we divided our households between Philadelphia and Colorado. And so my husband lived in Colorado with our other children, and Bowden and I lived in Philadelphia. Pardon me. This became our life. FaceTime. FaceTime was not just an interesting app. It was the way that we parented. I would FaceTime my 3-year-old daughter and my 7-year-old son for bedtime. And then we would wake up and I would FaceTime my husband so he could watch the experimental cells be pushed into his child halfway across the country. Pardon me. This is a world that no one can imagine, but the costs are not just emotional. I did lie, there is one chart. You don't have to understand it. I will detail it for you. In the last 5 years, we have made actually 22 trips to Philadelphia. The trial was paid for, the trial being the cells and the accommodations were paid for. but 22 round-trip flights for me or for my son, and then me or Joshua, whoever went, for the first year and a half. In the second half, actually, follow-on treatment, the study pays for it because it's so hard to get parents to continue into that edge of the trial. Childcare for our children that were back home. Miscellaneous expenses. This is a very conservative estimate of the 22 trips that we made to Philadelphia, but it's got a conservative price tag. Out-of-pocket costs for our family were $48,000. It's hard to stand in the space of being critical of clinical trial design when it saved your son. And also, from our space of survival, I am unwilling to let this be the barrier to entry for children who do not have the privileges that we have. You'll remember Will, Emily's dad. He was always reminding me, we will do anything for our kids, including moving to the big city, including putting an entire harvest season on hold, including putting siblings to bed via FaceTime. We would throw as much money as we had to at this problem. But the problem is, sometimes no matter how much money you throw at the problem is not solved. The science is good, but it is not great. On May 22nd, our dear friend, May 22nd, 2022, pardon me. I'm sorry, I've jacked that all up. Let me start from the beginning. On May 2nd, 2022, it's a lot of twos, our dear friend, Will and Lauren's daughter, Caroline's sister, Emily Lynn Chancellor, died from her leukemia. The CAR T had worked, but it did not work well enough. And when she passed, they planned a big Southern Baptist funeral, and it wasn't even a question. Josh and I knew we would go. But it was very present in the moment we had to tell our kids, the friends that we had made along the way from the cancer that we had promised medicine would fix, might not survive. And it was really in this moment, it was not in our experience, it was in Emily's death, that we realized that how we carried forward this story was more important than whether Bowden survived it. The practical way that it looks like to survive CAR T-cell therapy is often shown in clinical data from the child, but the part I'm going to share with you is the sibling story. The picture on the left is our son Jude, after I picked him up from school because he was having a panic attack. His legs hurt. And when you go through pediatric cancer as a sibling, you become hyper vigilant for the symptoms of relapse. And so I picked him up and I got him calmed down, but he was very upset that his legs hurt and that he was going to get leukemia. Luckily, I was able to move him through the idea that we can still have medical agency inside of our fear, and we could very easily go get a simple blood draw. The other anecdote is much sweeter, still horribly traumatizing, but cuter anyway. Selah was 3 years old and she was at her well child check, and the doctor was asking, "How are you feeling? How are you doing?" And she said, "I am good. I need the chemos." Her entire life had been Bowden's diagnosis. We got in the car and she couldn't figure out, she was very pouty, and I asked her what was wrong and she said, "I want the leukemia." She's 8 years old now, and many times through her childhood she has asked us, "When am I going to get cancer?" These are the kids that their data is not published in clinical trial medicine. This is left out of the laboratory setting. These are the families who are holding the innovation. Living inside of medical innovation is not knowing what's going to happen. There was no finish line for Bowden after he got his cell therapy. We did not ring the bell. We did not finish treatment. We simply had treatment in 2021, and we waited for days, for weeks, for months. What did we do with all this waiting? Well, here's a couple of examples. A couple of months after Emily died, Bowden went to visit her family in Mississippi. And one day I got a picture from Emily's mom of Emily's dad, Will, helping Bo ride Emily's pony. A year after Emily's death, the Chancellor family came to ski in Colorado, and they brought Mary Kennedy, this precious girl on the right, Emily's best friend. And our boys and this precious girl were all making sense of the same thing, which is how to make sense of promises that were not kept to them by the adults in their life. It got easier as we moved out further from treatment, first living in the gaps between trips to Philadelphia, but soon enough living for other things. And it's with my great, great thankfulness that I tell you that this year, Bowdoin will celebrate 5 years cancer-free. That is where everyone claps, as you should. It's a clap-worthy event. But you can imagine, given this whole slide deck, that on this side of survival, his survival is the last thing I'm worried about. At this point, what we're worried about is patient advocacy, the democratization of care, and decentralized access. It is not fair that you have to have a wildly tenacious mom and a dad with a lucrative job to get treatment. Bowdoin and I have been speaking in the patient advocacy space, and it is a gift every time. I'm gonna tighten up because I'm over time and I've got a story worth telling here, so stick with me. He's cute and he's got a stage presence to boot, so next year he'll come speak. All right, I want to share one more story. When I came here, I was trying to think of how to share our whole story with you guys, and it's a tough crowd because, as I mentioned, molecular scientists and people who study genomics for their entire career, it's hard to enter in. But what I do know is that this is a room full of people that realize we're all very deep in one story, but if we share it together, I would posit that we can actually keep more of the promises we're making. This past January, Bowdoin spent his Christmas break back on the Chancellor farm. He was trying to harvest his first buck. There's a sacred rite of passage that comes from harvesting your first buck, especially in the South. And the Chancellor family had told Bowdoin that if he got one, there would be a ceremonial processing, a giving of thanks, a stepping into manhood. I wasn't there. I'm actually not a hunter in any way. But I married one, so here we are. My husband went with him, and I was getting picture updates like this of them at 5 a.m. in the deer blind. And I thought, okay, I'm not much of a hunter myself, but there they are. They're with the Chancellors. They're on Emily's land. And as long as they're with them, I know there will be some kind of healing. And then I got this picture. Bo had gotten his first buck. There are ways to move through this world, to move forward with everything that has happened to you, with shame, with closing off, and with what we have realized, survival guilt. But our family, Emily's family, Ruth Crawford's family, we are choosing to tell the story of a boy anointed with the blood of a Mississippi buck in a rite of passage given to him by Will, the father of a girl that science could not yet save. This is the story we are choosing to tell. This is what families have to teach us about medicine. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll make it quick. 60 seconds, question or comment. When I was probably about 7 years old, contracted Hep C, and so it was kind of a long, arduous process. But I was never diagnosed until 1995 or something like that. So I got it back in 68 in Thailand. But so I have some empathy for that. But my comment is that to try to help treat, because I got to stage 2, 3 cirrhosis or radial fibrosis, stage 4 cirrhosis. But I used activated oxygen to help break down the scar tissue. But when I researched it, I heard that it was really good for cancer. But people get scared when you use the word activated oxygen. They think of it like ozone O3. But the Air Force has recorded all the way up to O21. O8 is supposed to be the gold standard. But cancer hates an anaerobic environment. Like E. coli,
Yeah.
when I'm fighting now, it's anaerobic. Aerobic, it doesn't matter. But with cancer, it's supposed to be like a real good adjunct, complementary therapy. But there's not a lot of money to be made, AMA, allopathy. But again, the word complementary, I think, is apropos. But it could help so many millions of people. Something as cheap and inexpensive as oxygen. But
Yeah. I mean, that brings up another soapbox I could step onto if I was given more time, which is to say there's a lot of supportive therapeutics that are not profitable and thus will not be studied and thus will not be published as safe. And we have a lot that we used and that I could talk about, but I think it brings up a point that, we kind of have touched on throughout the whole symposium, which is that if there's not a capitalist drive behind the innovation, it's hard to kind of move it forward. That's actually what's happening with CAR T cell therapy right now. It's hard to be funded because pharmaceutical companies are making a killing, for lack of a better word, on the chemotherapy protocols. And CAR T cell therapy is very, very expensive. So.
Are there other countries with centralized healthcare where this sort of CAR T therapy is freely available to all?
Yeah, no. CAR T cell therapy is in other countries, not very widely, because its production and the industry for it is very expensive. So even in places like England that have a different model, healthcare model, it's still mostly actually on trial. There's a product called Kymriah, which some people know about. It's it was approved a handful of years ago. But insurance companies do not receive it as frontline therapy. And so you have to have, I think, 3 relapses for Kymriah. And I would say clinicians would pursue, this is not a global statement, but would pursue bone marrow transplant before they pursue CAR T for a host of reasons I won't get into. Some financial and some based on published data.
Hi, Betsy. Thank you so much. I really just wanted to thank you both for your message, your fortitude, and your family. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was really impactful, and I'm so happy to have, or glad that you could share your experience.
Thanks.
And so there are a lot of basic scientists in the audience. I'm a baby basic scientist. And so I'm just curious about kind of, obviously, while you're going through this, I imagine there's a great desire to understand what is happening, understand what's happening with your son and the treatment, but not coming from that background. And so I'm curious about your experience learning the basic science and how much assistance you got in that regard from the clinical trial staff or any experts, and what can we do as scientists to make this knowledge more accessible for patients?
Yeah, it's interesting. This was in 2021, so there wasn't AI, which I think is a curse and a blessing, because I would have probably not slept for 3 years straight if I could have been using a large language model to expand my understanding. Clinical trials, clinicians are really limited in what they can educate you on, and I would say even when they educate you, it is not like a presentation I would give. And so it's hard to integrate how you would actually apply that to like the lived experience of a parent going through it. I ended up writing a blog. It was a medical diary of sorts that became a resource for parents because there is nothing out there that's not quite generic. The pediatric CAR T market is very small because it's used on leukemia, and leukemia has a 90% cure rate inside of standard chemotherapies, despite them being terribly toxic and having long-term side effects. There aren't a lot of parents who are signing up to try CAR T instead. And so there's not a lot of profitability to make CAR T widely available, and as such, most of the literature or the education that you could find from Gilead or Novartis or the pharmaceutical companies that are pushing them are geared towards adults. People get real weird when you start talking about kids and especially educating parents about them, which again is where this AI conversation gets really tricky because I'm an advocate. I understand the conversation from the clinical research perspective of kind of the problems that could happen with data. And as a parent who needs an answer and can't get it because the clinical trial won't answer me directly because of their legal limitations, and the parents don't even remember, other parents who have been through it don't really remember or can't really recall what happened to them specifically. I think that kind of the democratization of access to that education, which happens on something like Claude, I don't know. I guess it's an interesting conversation to have.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to ask you a quasi-science question about this that you implied through your story. If the side effects for the traditional treatment are very severe, which many of us know about from being around, and the CAR T therapy is less so, if one has the resources and the contacts, et cetera, does it make sense actually to try them in reverse order?
Absolutely. The trouble is that insurance does not cover them, and it's about $1 million out of pocket.
And so insurance covered yours because of the reverse?
No, because
you were in
the trial covered it. Yeah, so we were offered it at Children's Colorado. Once we told Children's, we're not going to do this, we're going to go to a trial. Turns out these are all businesses. They said, no, stay here, we can treat you. Insurance won't cover it, so we just need a private deposit of $1 million.
I see.
Which I was like, I guess we're moving to Philly. So, but I think, this brings up an interesting conversation because the side effects are long-term, most of them. There's short-term side effects, but they're somewhat mitigated by other pharmaceutical interventions. It's the long-term side effects. And so if a parent is given the option of a 90% cure rate that their child will do pretty well through, but they may have a secondary cancer when they're 60, versus a 70% cure rate.
Or 40 or 50.
Yeah, but not now.
Yes, of course.
Not today.
Of course.
Versus a 75, I think maybe the current data would be 75 to 80% cure rate with CAR T cell therapy, but they have to move halfway across the country. No one's signing up for that, or not many of us. And then they don't have enough data to move it through the FDA.
Right, so the missing piece in your answer is if you're in the 20 to 25% slice, which does not get cured by CAR T, is there any risk then of having waited and going back to the traditional therapy?
A clinician could probably answer this better, but I'm like looking at you. I think every time that you use an immunotherapy, specifically a CAR T product, you're putting pressure on the CD19 protein, so you could have what they call antigen escape, where the B cell basically says, oh no, it's looking for CD19, pull in all those proteins. I guess I'm thinking that wouldn't be a problem because if you were going back to standard chemotherapy, none of those are targeting CD19. Yeah, I mean, aside from the financial component, which is I don't think anyone will pay for a cell therapy, and then, it's all financial. It all comes down to finances.
Thank you.
Let's take one more question. Michael, right behind you.
Hi, thank you for your great talk. I wanted to ask you, with respect to finding trials matching people in need like you were, do you know of clinicaltrials.gov? Are you familiar with these websites now?
Yeah.
Because there is data out there. I'm a bioinformatics data science working against therapeutics, actually. I'm not on the clinical side.
Yeah.
But
clinicaltrials.gov is
it's hard to search. It's
similar to every other government entity,
Yeah, I hear you.
which is to say has a lot of hope and is very hard to interact with. I think, that's why I often speak on behalf of the Emily Whitehead Foundation, because it's a nonprofit that's kind of bridging the gap and using actually AI to develop more accurate models, because a lot of times clinicaltrials.gov is not up to date. It doesn't have the criteria in a way that a parent could access. It might have a clinician's view of it, but I'm not going to give that to a parent in the middle of the night who's panicking about finding therapy.
Yes, I
Yeah.
got you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's thank Betsy one more time.